Thank you, Mark. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, my colleague speakers, the chairman, and the moderator of this session. I'm going to be making a small presentation on thoroughbred breeding in India. May I begin with showing you the structure of my talk? We'll have early days, move on to the birth and flashback before 1947. That is the year India achieved independence. Then have a look at the disastrous setback after 1947, followed by the reconstruction and expansion phase, and its subsequent growth. History has it that races were held in Madras way back in the year 1780. Almost all the early racing in India was based on imported horses, either Arabs or horses from England and Australia. By the 1930s, a fair amount of breeding was going on in India, but most of it was for the needs of the army and very little was of commercial interest. Inevitably, there was an element of thoroughbred blood present due to these activities, and indigenous bred horses filtered into racing. One of the earliest breeders recorded in Indian history was Mr. Rustamji Supariwala, who later founded the Manjari stud, and Major Dennis Van Reenen from the Punjab. Indigenous bred horses were then called country breds, a term which was rather inappropriate. These horses are believed to have gained prominence in the early 18th century. The number of horses was on the increase, and so were the racecourses, as more areas in India came under the British rule. Horses and horsemen mushroomed in India, from the upper mouths of the Ganges to that of the Indus, and from the Himalayas to Madras in the south. Calcutta, however, became the colonial capital and became the headquarters of racing in India. India started importing horses under the British rule from various countries, and by the year 1862, as the sport of horses and racing grew in popularity, there were close to 100 racecourses in India. These were mostly in towns where there were British cantonments. Initially, there was no organized breeding in India, but it's so interesting to note that excellent horses like Dark Legend, Fastnet, Banwari, to name but a few, raced in India and returned to stud in Europe. The former two became noteworthy stallions, and the latter found a famous female line for the great Tessio's Domelo stud. For the transformation of the country bred into the Indian thoroughbred, the names of 4 individuals remain imperishable in Indian breeding history. Let's take a look at them. The first one is Sir Victor Sassoon, a lifelong ardent patron of racing in England and India, who won the Epsom Derby on 4 occasions with Pinza, Hardridden, Crepello, and St. Paddy. He formulated the Eve Bloodstock scheme, which operated in conjunction with the Royal West India Turf Club. This scheme was of signal importance in giving impetus to Indian breeders. The next name I'd like to mention is Mr. K.M. Munshi, the Home Minister in the Pre-Independence Congress administration of the Bombay Presidency. He insisted on reservation of certain races under the Royal West India Turf Club rules for Indian-bred horses. This led to the inception of the Indian Classics way back in 1942-43. This was again a cardinal contribution. I'll tell you a little more about Major Dennis Van Reenen. He was the one who founded the Renala stud. For many years, the preeminent stud in undivided India, where stood the important sire Sheridan. In his obituary in 1938, This is what the Bloodstock Review wrote. Interestingly, he was an Englishman who ran Renala stud mainly as a Remount stud. The fourth important gentleman is Mr. Faliwadia, who spearheaded the efforts of the breeding industry for the survival of racing in the 6 difficult years after independence, when racing was under the axe due to political decisions and the nascent Indian breeding industry was brought to its knees. His presentation to the then Prime Minister, Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru, was finally instrumental in the governments of Bombay and Madras reversing their stand in 1953 so that racing survived. Here, may I mention that the National Horse Breeding and Show Society of India had published an Indian stud book in the year 1927. This included horses from various breeds like the thoroughbreds, the trotters, the Marwadis, the Kathawadis, and so on. With the Eve Bloodstock scheme, which was linked to the Royal West India Turf Club Limited, becoming important in Western India, horses from the General Stud Book also gaining popularity, a Weatherby's-like organization was inevitable and essential in India. The RWITC took over as keepers of the Indian Stud Book and published the first volume of the Indian Stud Book in the year 1942. Now, let's take a flashback and look back and see what happened prior to the independence. Mr. Munsey's decision had tremendous impetus into breeding that studs in India have become home to great stallions. Just have a look and see the names. Glenlone, Hocus Pocus, Macon, Mondragon, Paradigm, Laughing Water, Wigbridge. Incidentally, Laughing Water was a dam of Her Majesty, the first Indian winning filly to have won 3 classics. However, around that time, the import of foreign horses was unfortunately halted in June 1941 due to the Second World War. By then, enough thoroughbreds were already in the country for the Indian breeding industry to get off to a flying start, and racing did not really suffer. Indian horses improved rapidly, with both physically and in racing ability. The wartime ban on the imports was lifted in the year 1945, and a substantial number of horses entered India. A lot of them purchased by Indian breeders arrived in the October of 1946. The effective number of mares, which was just about 385 in 1940, went on to cross the 1,000 marker by the year 1947. With this, the first stage in the history of the industry ended, and breeders looked forward with confidence to an era of consolidation. But this was not to be. There was subsequently the disastrous setback post-independence. Instead of development, disaster followed. In 1947, the new government of Bombay, only to be followed by the other state governments, declared the intention of banning racing abruptly. There was turmoil in the indigenous breeding industry. However, with great persuasion, a grace period was granted to stud farms by the government to wind up their operations. Many northern stud farms were lost to Pakistan, and many Indian stud farms shut down permanently, and the broodmare population plummeted to about 400. It was at this time, ladies and gentlemen, that the persistent efforts of Mr. Faliwadia helped the industry to emerge from a long troubled period. The 6 short years from 1947 to 1953 had done a great damage to indigenous breeding. Then came the phase of reconstruction and expansion. Though the process began soon thereafter, it took over 2 decades for the industry to bounce back to what it was prior to 1947. The main reason for this was the difference in political and economic conditions prevalent then. Whereas earlier the growth of the industry had been unhampered, post-independence, various obstacles had to be cleared due to political uncertainty, severe restriction on imports, land ceilings, and taxation policies. Then came the growth in the 60s and 70s. By the late 60s, there was discernible revival with slow import liberalization as the foreign exchange position in India improved. The stake money improved marginally, and there was an increase in the number of good class races. More breeders came in, and the quality of the Indian horse improved. A better situation in the 80s and 90s. The mid-80s saw substantial progress in breeding. The accelerating tempo of liberalization led to good quality horses being imported. You can take a look at the visual. Although there was considerable thoroughbred breeding activity in the northwest of the country, the Pune region came up as an area of sizable thoroughbred concentration. This was supplemented by exports in the 90s. With improvement in the quality of bloodstock, Indian breeders have ventured into foreign shores, and the exports after a long time in 1992-93 saw Astonish win in Hong Kong, which came as an eye-opener to the outside world. Adler in the United States of America, Simply Noble in Malaysia, Saddle Up, and Mystical winning back-to-back in Dubai, and many more. Here, ladies and gentlemen, may I mention the signal contribution by Mr. Zaware Poonawalla, who has, for the last 20 years, spearheaded the efforts by the National Horse Breeding Society of India to successfully promote the Indian horse abroad. Then came a lot of improvement in breeding stock. We've had Razin, the son of Northern Dancer, an all-time champion sire in the history of Indian breeding. Placerville, Al-Nazar Al-Washiq, Diffident, Glory of Dancer, Burden of Proof, and many more, and recently multidimensional. The same is true for broodmares as well. We have had the Indian champion mare Jacqueline, whose yearling colt by Galileo is set to be retained by Coolmore and its principal John Magnier in partnership. She has just foaled a colt by Galileo last week. A perusal of the official website of the Stud Book Authority of India will reveal much more than what I am able to mention in this short session. Let me now take you to a pictorial representation of the statistics and photographs. These statistics of the thoroughbred population are as on the 30th of April, 2014. These are yearlings at one of the oldest stud farms in India. Another farm in the Pune area. A farm in North India. And I'll now take you to a graph showing the broodmare population over the last 2 decades. A similar graph of the foal crop for the last 2 decades. The Stud Book Authority of India has a comprehensive library wherein all thoroughbreds can be traced in male line to one of the founding fathers, the Bailey Turk, the Dali Arabian, or the Godolphin Arabian, and in tail female line to the mares recorded in Volume 1 of the General Stud Book, which all we know was published first in the year 1791. The Stud Book Authority of India is recognized internationally and was invited to join the International Stud Book Committee, the apex body for thoroughbred breeding in the world, in the year 1980. It represents Asia along with Japan at the annual meetings of the International Stud Book Committee, which is held annually in September in Newmarket, England. The Asian Stud Book Conference has been playing an important role in guiding emerging stud books in the Asian zone, from Japan in the east to Turkey in the west. The first meeting of the Asian Stud Book Conference was held in Hyderabad in 1995, and Dr. Cyrus Poonawalla was its founding co-chairman. DNA typing of horses is carried out by Equine Parentage Validation Research Laboratory, which is accredited to the International Society for Animal Genetics. This, ladies and gentlemen, brings me to the end of my presentation. But before I do so, I'd like to acknowledge the support of the Stud Book Authority of India, Mr. Vivek Jain, Chairman, and the invaluable inputs given to me by Dr. Farooq Wadia, currently President of the National Horse Breeding Society of India, and who has been involved in Indian breeding and racing for over 6 decades. Thank you so much.